A man came forward then who carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. Captain Rowan, commander of the Blackmoor Gate, looked down at the shivering girl in the snow, with the royal pups in her arms, and instead of gratitude his face filled with something colder than the lake. He did not ask her name. He told the crowd what they were looking at. This outcast, he said, had not saved the pups at all. She had stolen them, taken them from the royal escort before the attack, and only been caught when the ice gave way beneath her. "That is a lie," Mara said, and her voice came out cracked and small. She had seen something while she warmed them. Beneath the wet fur of one pup ran a row of thin welts, the unmistakable mark of a whip, and on the inside of its leg the small bruised puncture where a needle had gone in. These animals had been hurt before they ever touched the water. She tried to say so. She tried to lift the pup and show them. Rowan did not let her finish. He spoke over her louder, telling the guards to keep the prisoner from touching the evidence further. An old wolf shouldered forward out of the dark white at the muzzle, moving with the stiffness of many winters. Garrick had stood at the tree line too, and he had seen all of it. He raised his voice for the girl, telling them plainly that she had gone into the water 4 times, that not one Blackmoor hand had reached past the shore, that she alone had carried the pups out. For a moment the crowd wavered. Then Rowan crossed to the old wolf and said something low, close to his ear, and whatever it was drained the color from Garrick's face. The old wolf looked at Mara with helpless apology and stepped back into the crowd and said nothing more. The woman in the fur-lined cloak chose that moment to weep. Lady Vera knelt in the snow with a grace that did not get her gown wet, pressed her gloved hands together, and grieved beautifully for the royal pups so cruelly endangered. Through her tears she begged the captain to do the only honorable thing. The girl, she said, must be brought back to Blackmoor and judged for the sake of the bloodline, for the sake of the kingdom. A guard seized the smallest pup and wrenched it from inside Mara's shirt. The pup did not cry out. It simply stopped. Its small ribs, which had been rising and falling against her, went flat and still, and a thin line of lake water ran from its mouth. Mara came up off the ground before anyone could hold her. She did not feel the hands grabbing at her arms. She took the limp body back, turned it, pressed her open palm hard against its chest and her mouth to the cold of its head, and she willed it to breathe the way she had willed herself to keep breathing under the ice. The pup coughed. Once, twice, and then drew a long, shuddering breath and pushed its nose into the crook of her neck. The crowd drew back from her as one. A girl from beyond the borders had stopped a royal life and started it again with her bare hands, and to a people raised on old fear there was only one explanation: forbidden magic. She had bound herself to the royal blood, they whispered. She had marked the heir for her own. Rowan looked down at her with the satisfaction of a man whose work had been done for him by other people's terror. At first light, he said, she goes before Alpha King Soren, and if the bloodline finds her guilty, she will not see another sunrise. They did not let her walk through the gates of Blackmoor. They dragged her. Mara had crossed onto Blackmoor land only once before in her life as a child, and she had been turned back at the wall with stones. Now she came through the great iron gate with her wrists bound, and a guard's fist in her hair, the smallest pup still hidden and breathing against her chest, because no one had been able to pry it loose without it failing again. The city woke to watch her pass. They leaned from windows and crowded the frozen street, and when they understood what she was, an outcast from beyond the borders walking their stones, the silence turned to contempt. A woman spat. A child asked its mother why the witch was allowed inside the walls, and the mother did not answer, only pulled the child close, as though Mara's shadow might stain it. She kept her eyes on the smallest pup. As long as it breathed, she could bear the rest. The council of elders was summoned before the night was half gone. Mara was made to kneel on the cold stone floor of a chamber lined with old men in gray, men who had not seen the lake, had not seen the ice, had not seen a single thing she had done, and who looked at her now as if the verdict had been reached long before she arrived. One of them rose with a heavy book and read aloud in the slow voice reserved for sentences the ancient blood law of Blackmoor. Any outsider who laid hands upon the royal bloodline without the leave of the throne was by the oldest law of the pack a threat to the throne itself. The punishment was death. Mara still did not know whose blood ran in the pup against her chest. She understood only one thing, clearly kneeling on that floor. She did not need to be guilty of anything. The law alone was enough to kill her, and she had already done the thing it forbade. She had laid her hands on the royal blood. She had done it in the water to keep it alive. Lady Vera had changed her wet furs for dry ones, and her grief for something more useful. She moved among the elders like a daughter among fathers, her voice soft and reasonable, urging them not to let sentiment delay them. The bloodline had to be protected, she said. Its purity could not be left a single night in doubt, while an outsider sat inside the walls, with the royal young in her arms. Judge her quickly, she counseled, and let Blackmore sleep clean. Then Captain Rowan laid his evidence before the council, and Mara felt the floor tilt under her. He held up a strip of torn cloth. It was hers, the same rough weave as the shirt she had wrapped around the pups, and he told the elders it had been found that very morning snagged on the gate of the royal nursery far inside the keep in a wing she had never entered and could not have reached. A piece of her placed where it proved she had crept into the heart of Blackmore to steal the heir before the escort ever left. She stared at the cloth. She knew the law had been read against her by men who already despised her. But the cloth was something else. The cloth had been cut from her clothing and carried into the keep and hung on that gate by a hand that had known before she ever stood at the tree line that an outcast girl would be needed to take the blame. Someone had built this trap and waited for the lake to fill it. The attack on the escort, the ice. The men who would not move all of it had been arranged, and she had simply walked into the only role left empty. She opened her mouth to say it, and the smallest pup chose that moment to begin convulsing again. The royal healer, a thin man with careful hands, had finally been allowed to take it for examination, and the instant it left the warmth of her body, its spine arched, and its breath caught in a thin, terrible wheeze. The chamber broke into noise. The healer fought to hold it. The elders half rose, and Mara, still bound, forgot the cloth and the law and the watching faces entirely. "Give him back to me," she said. "Please, he stops breathing without the heat. I am not asking you to free me, I am asking you to let him live." She heard how it sounded even as she said it. Every word made her case worse. A girl who could keep the heir alive when the royal healers could not was either touched by forbidden magic or had poisoned him in the first place, and either way the rope tightened. She knew it. She begged anyway because the small body on the table had gone the color of the lake, and she would rather hang for it than watch it die 3 feet from her hands. The healer, white-faced, looked to the elders for permission. The elders looked to one another, and in that hanging moment before anyone could answer, the great doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and the noise died all at once, as though a hand had closed over every throat in the room. A man stood in the doorway. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. The elders bowed their heads, the guards dropped to one knee, and even Lady Vera lowered her eyes. He carried no crown and no sword, only the weight of a grief that had hollowed him out from the inside. The grief of a father who had buried the hope of a son weeks ago and had been searching the cold country for a body ever since. Alpha King Soren had come to see the witch who was said to have stolen his dead heir. Soren crossed the hall slowly, and the cold came off him like a draft from an open door. Weeks in the saddle had carved the warmth out of his face. He had ridden the frozen country to its edges, searching for the carriage that vanished, had turned over the burned remains of way stations, and questioned trappers, and dug through snow with his own hands, and had come home each time with nothing. A man could only carry that for so long before something inside him froze to keep him standing. He looked at the bound girl on his floor the way he might have looked at a stone. Captain Rowan told the story, and he told it well. By the time he finished, the lake had become a kidnapping. Mara had taken the pups from the escort. The masked attack had been her own people closing the trap, and the ice had simply caught her before she could carry the heir away. The torn cloth on the nursery gate proved she had been inside the keep for days. The whole crime fit together as smoothly as a thing built to fit. Lady Vera spoke when he was done, and she was careful to seem reluctant. She knew she said that the king had a merciful heart, and she knew how it might look to condemn a poor young woman with cut hands kneeling in rags. But mercy here would be a knife in Blackmore's back. The law existed precisely so that a king's pity could not be used as a doorway by his enemies. If Soren spared the girl because she was pitiable, every house in the kingdom would learn that the bloodline could be touched by anyone willing to look pathetic enough afterward. The elders pressed in behind her words. To protect the outsider was to set the king's affection above the oldest law of the pack. It would weaken the throne. It would invite the next plot and the next. The ancient blood law was clear, and a king who bent it was a king already half pulled down. Then Soren looked at Mara and for the first time asked her to speak. She told the truth. She told it plainly, without ornament, because she had nothing else to offer. She had been gathering firewood. She had heard the horses and the breaking ice. She had seen the masked riders, and she had seen the carriage forced out onto the thin water, and she had seen the pups go under. And she had seen the whole shining line of Blackmoor, its nobles and its guards and its torches standing on the safe shore while children drowned because they were more afraid of an old story about the lake than they were ashamed of doing nothing. The hall received this in silence and then a low ripple of anger because she had named their cowardice to their faces, and no one forgives that. No one believed her. The truth said without proof sounded exactly like the kind of thing a clever criminal would invent. Soren ordered the smallest pup brought to him. The guard who reached for it learned what the healer had already learned. The pup snapped, caught the meat of his thumb, and the moment his grip loosened, it dropped to the floor and began to crawl. Not toward the king, not toward the warmth of the great hearth. It dragged its small body the length of the cold stone past boots and spear butts, and the hems of noble robes straight back to Mara, and it climbed into the cradle of her bound hands and stopped trembling where it felt safe. Soren went very still. He had caught the scent. Beneath the lake water and the fever and the blood on the girl's hands, his own blood answered from the small body in her arms, the unmistakable thread that ran through his line and no other. Every instinct in him, the wolf under the king, knew what the law refused to admit. The heir he had buried in his heart was alive here, 3 steps away, choosing the arms of the very woman his court had named a thief. But Soren had not survived this long by trusting what he wanted to be true. Grief made men see their dead in every shadow. He would not free a prisoner, overturn the law, and stake the throne on a feeling in his chest, not when every object in the room, the cloth, the timing, the impossible recovery, the binding the crowd had witnessed at the lake pointed the other way. Instinct was not evidence. He had ridden 1,000 cold miles learning the difference. So he said nothing of the scent. He let his face stay stone. The eldest of the council took his silence for permission and pronounced it. The outsider would be held in the prison beneath the keep until first light. At sunrise, under the ancient blood law, judgment would be carried out. They lifted Mara to her feet. The pup would not let go of her fingers, and a guard had to peel it away one paw at a time while it cried. And the sound of that crying followed her down into the dark long after the great doors had closed. The prison beneath the keep was colder than the lake had been because the lake at least had ended. Here the cold simply went on. They left her in a stone cell with no fire and no blanket, and the fever that had been building since the water finally took her, so that she shook on the floor with her cut hand pressed under her arms and could not tell whether her eyes were open or closed. The ice had opened her palms to the bone in 3 places. They had not been cleaned. She lay in the dark and listened to her own heart and waited for sunrise to come and finish what the lake had started. It was not sunrise that came for her. It was a torch, and behind it a guard, and the guard did not drag her this time. He told her the king required her, and there was something almost afraid in the way he said it. In the royal healing chamber, the smallest pup was dying. The healers had done everything their craft allowed, and the small body was slipping through their fingers anyway, its breath gone shallow, its heart stuttering. They had told the king the plain truth that it would not last until first light. And the king, who could not free her and could not save his heir, had been left with one unbearable fact. The pup steadied only when the girl was near. Whatever the court called it, magic or poison or a bond made on the ice, the animal lived in her presence and failed in her absence. And a father will set aside a great many principles to keep the last of his blood breathing one more hour. So they brought her up out of the dark and set her by the fire, and they put the dying pup in her hands, and they watched. Mara forgot that they were watching. She had nursed dying things her whole life, lambs and kids, and once a human child in a winter when no healer would cross the border for the poor, and her hands knew the work without asking her. She laid the pup along her forearm with its head lower than its body and pressed the heel of her hand up its small ribs in slow, firm strokes, and lake water came up out of its lungs in a thin trickle and then more. She breathed warmth into the wet fur. She tucked it into the curve of her body where the fire could reach it, and her heartbeat could reach it, and she did not stop hour after hour while the candles burned down. Soren watched from the shadow beyond the firelight and said nothing. He had come prepared to see a witch at her craft. Instead, he saw a tired girl doing the oldest and least magical thing in the world, keeping a small life warm with her own body, because there was nothing else to keep it warm with. He had read the cloth and the law and the testimony, and they had built him a thief. The thing in front of the fire did not match the thing in the documents, and the gap between them had begun very quietly to trouble him. It was near the deepest part of the night that Mara found it. She was working the pup's hind leg, feeling for the cold that meant the blood had stopped reaching it, when her thumb passed over a place in the fur that was not like the rest, a small swelling. She parted the fur to the skin, and there it was, the same mark she had glimpsed at the lake, and been given no chance to show a single needle's puncture, days old, ringed with a faint bruise. Not a wound from the ice, not a wound from the water. A needle had gone into this animal before it ever reached the lake. She understood it then all at once, the way you understand a thing your body already knew. The pups had not lost their footing on bad ice. They had been drugged, made slow and heavy and helpless, and then the carriage had been forced out onto the part of the lake that could not hold it. The whole drowning had been arranged, and the arranging had begun long before any escort left Blackmoor. She turned to the shadow where the king stood. "My lord," she said, "I have to show you something. This was done to him before the water. Someone—" The chamber door opened. Captain Rowan came in with 4 armed men at his back, and he did not wait to be acknowledged. He had something in his hand, and he held it up, so the firelight caught it, a small dark bottle stoppered with wax. He had found it, he announced, sewn into the lining of the prisoner's clothing when her rags were searched. A poison, the kind used to weaken a wolf from the inside. And here was the proof of it all, the last piece, that the outcast had not merely stolen the heir, but had been poisoning him by slow degrees from the first moment she touched him, so that he would fail no matter who held him, and her false healing was nothing but the cure she withheld until it suited her. Soren looked at the bottle gleaming in Rowan's fist. Then he looked at the small, unconscious body in the girl's lap, alive, only because she had not stopped working over it all night long. And for a long moment the King of Blackmoor stood between 2 truths, and did not know which one was a lie. Sunrise came gray and reluctant, and they brought Mara up into the great hall to die. The whole of Blackmoor's court had gathered, the nobles in their winter furs, the elders in their gray, the gate guards along the walls, and at the far end on a dais of black stone, the king. They had cleaned her hands at last, not out of mercy, but so the wounds would not seem an excuse, and they had given her a clean shift so that the court would not have to look at rags while it passed sentence. She stood in the center of the hall where everyone could see her, a girl from beyond the borders about to be unmade by the oldest law in the country, and she was so tired that the fear had burned away and left only a strange, clear calm. Lady Vera spoke first, and she had put on her finest performance for the largest audience. She did not rage. She grieved with the steady dignity of a woman who loved her kingdom too well to enjoy what had to be done. This girl, she told the court, had not stumbled onto the lake by chance. She had been placed, sent across the border by enemies of the bloodline, schooled in forbidden craft and aimed at the air like an arrow. The proof of it lay in everything they had seen, the impossible bond, the convulsions, whenever she let go the poison sewn into her clothes. Vera's voice caught beautifully on the word heir, and several of the noblewomen wept with her. Rowan laid the case out piece by piece, the poison bottle held high. 2 witnesses, gatemen, who swore they had seen the outcast inside the keep days before the escort left near the royal nursery in the very wing the torn cloth had come from. The cloth itself passed hand to hand among the elders. Each piece had been cut to fit the next, and together they made a wall that no plain truth could climb. Then the old wolf came forward. Garrick was afraid. Mara could see it in the stiffness of his shoulders, could guess what Rowan had whispered to him at the lake to buy his silence, and she understood the cost of what he was about to spend. He stood before the king, and he told the court what he had seen with his own old eyes, that the outcast had gone into the black water 4 times, that she had carried the pups out one by one, while every Blackmoor man stood dry on the shore, that whatever they had decided she was, he had watched her nearly drown to save the very life she now stood accused of stealing. The council fell on him at once. What was the word of one half-blind old wolf against the evidence of the captain of the gate? They questioned his sight, his memory, his loyalty. They reminded the hall with delicate cruelty that age softens more than the joints. They did not let him finish. By the time they were done with him, Garrick stood smaller than when he had begun, and the truth he had spent his safety to speak lay on the floor of the hall, trampled. And Soren sat above it all in the worst seat in the kingdom. He saw the trap as clearly now as Mara had seen it in the dark, or nearly. He had watched the girl work over his dying heir all night with hands that asked for nothing. He did not believe the bottle, but belief was not the same as proof, and a king does not rule on what he believes in his chest. If he stepped down from the dais and defended her, he would be setting his own feeling above the ancient blood law in front of the entire court, and every elder in the room would mark it, and the throne would be the weaker for it from that hour on. If he let the law take her, the only living soul who could keep his air breathing would hang at sunrise, and the small thing he had searched the frozen country for would die 3 days after he found it. He had ridden 1,000 miles to find a body. He had not imagined that finding the living heir would mean choosing whether to kill the girl who kept it alive. The eldest of the council rose to pronounce the sentence. Mara did not beg. They were all waiting for it. She could feel it, the held breath of a crowd that wanted to watch the outcast plead. She gave them nothing. When the elder asked if she had any final word, she lifted her cut hands and asked only one thing. Not for her life. She asked that the other pups, the ones still living, be kept warm through the cold nights, and not handed off to careless men because they were young and they had nearly died, and they would be frightened. That was all. That was the whole of her last request. The elder opened his mouth to deliver the verdict, and from somewhere far back in the keep, faint through the stone, came a sound that stopped him. A thin, weak cry. The smallest pup alone in the healing chamber calling. In the same breath before the cry had even faded, something moved in the great hall itself. Set into the wall, behind the dais, in a recess older than any law the elders had read, hung the moonstone. It had been there for as long as Blackmore had been Blackmore, a pale, round stone the size of a fist. And in living memory, it had done nothing at all, but hang and gleam dully in the dark. Now it trembled. No hand was near it. No wind reached it. It shook in its setting as though something inside it had woken, and a faint light, the cold, colorless light of the moon on snow, began to rise within it. The great hall went silent the way a forest goes silent before a storm. Every elder, every noble, every guard turned toward the stone, and the verdict died unspoken in the old man's throat. Soren was on his feet. "Hold," he said, and the word fell into the silence like a stone into a well. "The sentence is suspended." For the first time since Mara had laid eyes on her, Lady Vera's lovely composure slipped. Only for an instant, only at the corners, but Mara saw it, and she understood what it meant. Vera had bought witnesses and forged cloth, and sewn poison into a stranger's clothes. And not one of those things could be done to the moonstone. It could not be bribed. It could not be coached. Whatever it had woken to say, it would say in front of the entire court, and there was no hand in Blackmore that could stop its mouth. Soren turned to his guards, and his voice had changed. The exhaustion was gone out of it. "Bring the heir," he said. "Bring the smallest pup from the healing chamber and set it before the moonstone here where every soul in this hall can see." The guards went. The court did not breathe, and every eye in Blackmore turned toward the pale, waking stone, none of them yet knowing that the next few moments would decide not only whether the girl in the center of the hall lived or died, but what kind of kingdom Blackmore was going to be. They carried the smallest pup into the great hall on a folded cloth, and set it on the stone floor beneath the moonstone in full view of every soul in Blackmore. For a long moment nothing happened. The stone, which had trembled and glowed only minutes before, hung dark and dull in its old recess. The pup lay where they had placed it, too weak to lift its head, its breath a thin whistle in the silence. And the longer the stone stayed dark, the louder the whispers grew. The elders leaned to one another. The council had found its footing again. If the moonstone had truly woken for the heir, where was its light now? Perhaps there had been a draft. Perhaps the old stone had simply settled. Perhaps the outcast had invented the whole tale and the cry from the chamber and the rest of it. Lady Vera seized the silence like a weapon. She stepped forward, her composure restored, and she spread her hands to the court. "There," she said. "Let them all witness it." The stone of Blackmore, the oldest and truest judge in the kingdom, lay silent before the girl's claims. What more proof could the court need? The moonstone itself had refused to call this dying animal the Heir. The Outcast had deceived them all, and now even the ancient stone had named her a liar. A guard moved to take the pup away. Before his hands reached it, the pup cried. A small, broken sound, and then it did the thing it had done at the lake, and in the chamber, and in this very hall the night before. It began to crawl, away from the guard, away from the moonstone, dragging its ruined strength across the cold floor toward the one place in all of Blackmore it had ever felt safe, toward Mara. "Let her go to him," Soren said. The council protested at once. To let the accused approach the Heir in the middle of judgment, to let the very hands suspected of poison touch him before the court, it was madness. It was a mockery of the law. Soren did not look at them. "Let her go to him," he said again, and there was something in the way he said it that ended the argument. The guards loosed her. Mara crossed the floor and knelt beside the pup, and she did not reach for the moonstone or make any sign or speak any word. She simply laid her open hand against the small heaving side, the same hand cut to the bone, on the ice, the same gesture she had made all night by the fire, and she steadied him the only way she knew how. The moonstone erupted. Light burst from it, not the faint glow of before, but a flood of brilliant silver that poured across the hall, and threw every face into sudden cold brightness. And in the heart of that light, hanging in the air above the pup for all of Blackmore to see, rose the royal blood marked the sigil that ran through Soren's line, and through no other house in the world, blazing and unmistakable. The great hall made no sound at all. There could be no argument with the stone. The smallest wolf pup, the half-drowned creature the court had spent a night and a sunrise treating as evidence in a theft, was the lost heir of Blackmore alive, returned confirmed before the whole kingdom by the one judge that could not be bought. And in a single stroke, every accusation built against the girl kneeling beside him fell to pieces. She had not stolen the heir. She had carried him out of the lake. She had kept him breathing through the night that the royal healers had given him up. The wall of evidence Rowan had raised stood revealed as exactly what it was, a thing built to bury the truth that now blazed in the air above them all. But the moonstone was not finished. Its light did not fade. Instead, it bent, turned, drawn to something else in the hall, and it slid down the length of Mara's arm and gathered brightening around the small thing that hung on a cord at her throat. An old wooden pendant, worn smooth by years of handling the only thing she owned that had been her father's. The silver light sank into the carved face of it and lit the worn symbol there until it could be read across the whole of the great hall. Garrick made a sound. The old wolf pushed forward, staring at the pendant, as though he had seen a ghost, and his voice shook when he finally spoke. He knew that mark. Every wolf of his years knew that mark, though none had spoken of it in a long time. It was the crest of the royal guardians, the old sworn line, the family that, for generation upon generation, had been entrusted with one charge above all others, the protection of the Alpha King's blood. And then the truth that had been buried for years came up into the light all at once. Mara's father had been a royal guardian. He had worn that crest and kept that oath until he had been accused of a treason he never committed, stripped of his name, and driven out beyond the borders to live and die among the outcasts. He had carried the disgrace to his grave, a guardian condemned as a traitor, and he had left his daughter nothing but a worn wooden pendant and a place outside the walls where the law threw stones at children. Mara was not a lost princess. The court had been quietly braced for that, a hidden royal returning to claim a crown. The truth was harder and plainer and worse. She was the daughter of the man who had given everything to protect the royal family and whom the royal family had thrown away on a lie. She had not crossed the lake to steal Blackmore's blood. She had been born to guard it, and she had done so on the breaking ice without knowing it was the very oath her father died accused of betraying. Soren rose slowly from the dais, and the strength that had drained from him over weeks of grief came back into his face, changed, harder, turned outward now. He looked at the girl kneeling on his floor, and he understood in the cold light of the stone that Blackmore's debt to her was far older and far worse than the saving of his son. The kingdom did not merely owe her thanks. It owed her family justice for a wrong it had done in the dark and never answered for. Lady Vera tried once to hold the floor. Coincidence, she called it. A trick of old light on an old stone, a peasant's trinket lit by chance. But the moonstone went on shining steady and merciless over the air and over the crest both, and her words fell into the silver light and died there. The council could no longer deny the blood of the heir, and it could no longer deny the blood of the girl who had carried him. And looking down at Mara, Soren saw the whole shape of it for the first time. Blackmore had not simply abandoned the outcast who threw herself onto the breaking ice to save his son. Long before this night, in a quieter and more shameful way, it had betrayed the very family that had once been sworn to protect the throne itself. "Seal the keep," Soren said. The order went out before anyone could think to disobey it. Every gate within Blackmore Keep swung shut, and barred the great doors of the hall closed. And the king made it plain in 5 words that no noble would set foot outside the chamber until the truth had been spoken to its end. The trap that had been built around an outcast girl now closed around the people who had built it, and they felt it close. Garrick found his voice again, and this time no one whispered him down. He stood in the silver light and told the court the thing he had been too frightened to finish at the lake. It was Captain Rowan who had held the shore. Rowan who had ordered the gatemen to keep their feet on solid ground, who had threatened with his own blade any man who moved to wade in after the drowning pups, who had stood over the ice and let it happen. The old wolf had carried that knowledge in shame for a day and a night, and he set it down now in front of the king. Then the doors opened to admit Soren's own soldiers back from the frozen lake at the king's order, and they carried the lake's evidence with them. They had read the ice the way Mara had read the pup. They laid it out on the stone for the court to see. The carriage tracks did not wander. They ran straight and deliberate from the safe road to the thinnest, weakest stretch of the whole lake, driven there on purpose. Among the reeds at the shore, they had found a discarded glass vial, the twin of the needle's work in the heir's fur. And on the bodies of the rescued pups beneath the matted fur, the welts of a whip that had driven frightened animals where they were meant to go. And they had caught someone, one of Lady Vera's own servants, taken behind the stables in the gray of dawn, trying to burn a mud-stained cloak in a brazier. Brought before the king with the half-scorched cloak in evidence, the man's nerve broke. He confessed it in pieces then all at once. It was the lady who had given the order to divert the royal escort onto the lake. It was the captain who had gathered the masked men and paid them and set the ambush. The pups had been drugged in the keep before they ever left, so they would be too slow to save themselves, and the lake had been chosen because the old fear of it would keep every honest wolf standing on the shore. The whole design lay bare. Kill the heir on the ice where no one would be blamed because no one had dared to act. Leave Soren a king without a successor, and without a future, isolated, grief-broken, easily steered. And in time, with the true line ended, set Lady Vera's own son in the empty place at the head of the succession. It had wanted only one thing the plotters had not foreseen: an outcast girl gathering firewood, who did not believe the old story about the lake. 2 of the elders went gray. Pressed, they admitted what was worse than ignorance. They had suspected a hand behind the heir's disappearance for weeks. They had said nothing because silence kept their seats and their influence, and a dead heir was no threat to men who served whoever sat the throne. And Lady Vera, seeing the whole of it come apart, stopped pretending. She drew herself up, and the grieving noblewoman was gone, and in her place stood something colder and prouder, and entirely unashamed. Blackmore needed a strong and certain heir, she told the silent court, a pure heir, a future that did not hang by the cut hands of a peasant from beyond the walls. She had done what the cowards on the council had not the stomach to do. She regretted only that it had failed. It was Rowan who moved first. He understood before she did that there were no more words that could save them, and a man like Rowan did not wait quietly for judgment. He drew his sword in a single motion and crossed to the folded cloth where the heir lay, and he snatched the small body up in his free arm, the blade bright at its side, a last hostage between himself and the door. Mara was already moving. She did not think about the blade. She put herself between the captain and the child, between the steel and the small warm weight she had carried out of the lake, and when Rowan struck to clear his way, the blow that had been meant to open his path opened her shoulder instead. She felt the cold of it before the pain, and she did not fall, and she did not let go of the pup, turning her body around it so that her back took the worst of him, and her arms made a cage the steel could not reach. What happened then happened too fast for the court to follow. The smell of her blood, the sight of the heir in an enemy's grip, the long night's grief and rage all came up in Soren at once, and the king did not stay a man. He shifted half and terrible, the alpha tearing up through the king, and he was across the hall before Rowan could reach the door. He did not let him escape. He brought the captain down hard onto the black stone, the air spilling free into Mara's waiting arms, and the sword skittered away across the floor and rang against the wall and went still. And as Rowan went down beneath the alpha king lady, Vera looked at the wreck of everything she had built, the confessed servant, the captured captain, the lake's evidence laid bare, the heir alive, in the arms of the girl she had chosen to hang, and she understood at last that there was not one lie left anywhere in the world that could save her. Justice came quickly once it came at all. Rowan was stripped of his rank where he lay, the captaincy of the Blackmoor Gate taken from him, and his name set down for treason against the crown. Lady Vera was made to stand, and hear her title taken from her before the whole of the court that had once bowed to her and her family crest. The proud carved shield that had hung in the great hall for generations was brought down and broken on the black stone at her feet, so that every soul in Blackmoor would know the house had fallen and why. The elders who had suspected the plot and held their tongues to keep their seats were removed from the council that same hour, and the nobles who had stood dry on the shore of the lake while a girl drowned for their heir were called by name one after another and made to answer aloud for what their cowardice had nearly cost the kingdom. In the middle of it all, Mara fell. She had stayed standing longer than she had any right to, the heir clutched safe against her chest, but the shoulder Rowan's blade had opened had been bleeding the whole while, and the night and the lake and the fever and the long sleepless work over a dying pup had finally taken everything she had. Her knees gave. The hall lurched, and before she struck the floor, Soren caught her. The king did not call for a servant. He gathered her up. Himself, the outcast, his court had been an hour from hanging, and he carried her out of the great hall and through the cold corridors to the healing chamber, and he laid her down beside the same fireplace where she had spent the night saving his son. He set the heir down at her side, where it burrowed at once into the curve of her uninjured arm, and went quiet, and he stayed. When Mara woke, the fire was low, and the pain in her shoulder was bound, and her first clear thought was that the sentence had not yet been carried out. She came up with a start, certain she was still a prisoner, certain they had only kept her alive to hang her properly at the next sunrise, and she reached for the heir to be sure he was breathing. Soren was kneeling beside her, not standing over her, kneeling, the Alpha King of Blackmoor, on the stone floor of his own keep, with the whole court crowded at the chamber doors to see it. For a moment she did not understand what she was looking at. Kings did not kneel. Kings had never in the whole long memory of the pack knelt to anyone, least of all to a girl from beyond the walls. He spoke quietly, but the hall behind him was silent enough that every word carried. He asked her forgiveness for doubting her when his own blood had crawled across the floor to her arms, and told him the truth he was too careful to hear. For letting the ancient blood law, the law meant to guard the bloodline, be sharpened into a blade against the one person who had saved it, and for the older wrong, the deeper one, for letting Blackmoor break a faithful man on a lie and throw his daughter out beyond the borders to be stoned in the road. Then he rose and he set the wrong to right in the only coin a king could pay. Before the assembled court he restored the name of Mara's father, the royal guardian, condemned for a treason he never committed, cleared and honored and spoken of with respect for the first time in years. And he named Mara herself what her blood and her courage had already made her. Guardian of the royal heir, sworn protector of the line she had carried out of the lake, her place no longer beyond the walls, but at the very heart of the throne she had been born to defend. The court bowed. It was finished, the watching faces seemed to say. The wrong was answered, the girl was raised, the story had found its happy end. Mara looked at the broken crest on the floor of the hall, beyond the doors, and at the king who had knelt to her, and at the small warm weight breathing against her arm, and she asked one quiet question. If Blackmoor truly regrets what was done here, she said, then what becomes of the people still living beyond these walls, the ones no king has ever knelt for, the ones the law still throws stones at? And the great hall, which had been so ready to call the story finished, had no answer for her at all. When they offered her gold, she refused it. When they offered her a title and rooms in the keep and a life of soft and grateful comfort, she refused that too. Mara asked for 3 things instead, and none of them were for herself. She asked that Blackmoor open its granaries to the poor villages beyond the border, the ones that starved each winter while the keep ate well. She asked that the road to the frozen lake be rebuilt so that no traveler need ever take the ice again. And she asked for a sanctuary, a warm and tended place for abandoned wolf pups so that no small life would ever again be left to the cold because no one thought it worth saving. Soren granted all 3 before the court, and then he went further than she had asked. The gates of Blackmoor were open to the people it had once driven out. The old laws were taken down and read again with honest eyes, and the cruelest of them did not go back up. The council was rebuilt slowly, and the new seats went to men and women chosen for the truth in them rather than the gold behind them. The months turned. The Heir grew strong, and wherever he was in the keep, when Mara entered a room, he ran to her first before tutors or nurses or even the king. The royal wolves who bowed only to the throne took to lowering their heads when she passed, not because anyone had commanded it, but because they had decided in the way wolves decide that she was worth it. And Soren, who had begun by owing her his son's life, found the debt quietly becoming something else. He did not love her because she had saved the Heir. He loved her because she had told the truth in a hall full of people who wanted her to lie, and had asked, when she might have asked for anything, what would become of the forgotten. A year to the day after the ice broke, the new bridge across the frozen lake was finished. The whole pack came to see it. The Heir, walking now, broke from the crowd and ran the length of the new stone into Mara's arms, and in front of all of Blackmoor he called her Mama Mara. And no one corrected him. Soren came to her then and put into her hands her father's pendant, restored and reinforced now with royal silver, the crest of the royal guardians made whole again. And then he placed beside it the Luna's crown, and he did not set it on her head. He left it in her hands, hers to take up or to set down, hers to choose. She had been chosen against her whole life. She had been chosen to take the blame, chosen to hang, chosen to be thrown beyond the walls. This was the first thing that had ever been left for her to choose. She chose to stay. Not for debt, not for any prophecy, not for any oath sworn in her blood, but because somewhere between the breaking ice and the broken crest, she had found the one thing she had never let herself want, a family that was hers. And so the story ended where it began, at the edge of the frozen lake. The whole of the Blackmoor pack went down on one knee before the outcast girl they had once watched drown. This time their alpha did not command it. They knelt because the girl who had stepped onto the breaking ice when no one else would had become in the end the Luna their kingdom had never deserved, and finally painfully learned to be worthy of. The lake that had witnessed Blackmoor's deepest shame became the place where its truest gratitude is remembered to this day. And if this story stayed with you, stay a moment longer, because there is another waiting just beyond the ice. Mara had learned long ago that the ice on the frozen lake sang before it broke, a thin, high whine beneath the snow, and tonight it was screaming. She stood at the tree line with her arms full of firewood when the royal carriage came apart across the black water horses, shrieking, a wheel spinning loose into the dark. She had no idea that the small shapes spilling from the overturned carriage were the future of a kingdom. She only knew the sound they made, the same sound any dying thing makes when the cold begins to take it. Masked riders melted back into the pines the moment the ice gave way. On the far shore, where torches burned in a neat and useless line, the nobles of Blackmoor did not move. Their guards did not move. They believed the cursed lake stripped a grown wolf of its second shape the instant it touched the water, and so they stood there, and they let the small ones go under. Mara dropped the firewood. She did not think about the law that forbade her kind from crossing onto Blackmoor land. She did not think about the woman in the fur-lined cloak on the shore, the one who pressed a gloved hand to her mouth and made no sound at all. She thought only that the smallest of the shapes had slipped beneath the surface and not come up again. She ran out onto the ice as it split beneath her boots and the water closed over her like a fist. When she broke the surface the last time a pup clutched against her chest, she felt rather than saw the tiny crown-shaped mark of silver fur behind its ear. She did not know what it meant, but far across the lake, watching the outcast girl rise, streaming and half-dead from water that should have killed her, Lady Vera lowered the glove from her lips and whispered, "He's still alive." The cold had gone deeper than skin by the time Mara dragged herself back onto solid ground. She could not feel her hands. She tore the soaked outer layer from her own body, useless and freezing as it was, and wrapped the smallest of the pups inside her shirt, pressing it flat against the bare skin over her heart, where a little warmth still lived. The other she gathered into the curve of her arms, 3 small bodies shuddering against her, and she breathed on them. And she rubbed their chests with her numb fingers the way she had once warmed half-frozen lambs in a shed with no fire. One by one they began to stir. That was when the shore came alive. Now that the danger had passed, the brave men of Blackmoor found their courage. A young noble in a clean, dry cloak shouldered through the others and planted himself in front of the torchlight, and in a loud, carrying voice he announced that he had pulled the royal pups from the water with his own 2 hands. No one corrected him. The men who had stood and watched a girl drown for them looked at their boots and said nothing. Mara was too cold and too tired to argue. Her teeth were chattering too hard to form the words. It did not matter to her who took the credit, only that the small ones lived, but the smallest pup would not let the lie stand. Every time a guard reached to lift it away toward the noble, it twisted out of his grip and crawled back across the snow, dragging its half-frozen body until it pressed itself once more against Mara's chest and went still.